I'll give everybody a test audio. Natalie, I'm talking now. I'm assuming you can hear me. Got a couple thumbs up. I'm trying to decide if I like Zach's spiffy stock photo, Steve's background, or Jenny's witness protection program look the best. They're all really good. Oh, hey, Jenny. There you are. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. I'm sure we'll have a lot of people joining here in the next few minutes. So quick overview of our agenda for today. I'm going to do a couple introductions. Megan Sullivan is going to share a little bit about her recent experience and something that she's been working on that I think is a great suggestion for all of us to be thinking about for the next couple weeks. I'm going to hand it off then to my friend Phil Daubenmeyer, who's on the call with us here. Phil's with Merchants Bank to talk about the SBA 7A loans as a part of the payroll protection program. And then we'll take a little break, and Emily Burford will then take it away on a conversation for the first two tactics from the book Shift. So before we kind of kick off, I want to do an introduction. So if you're on the call and you looked at the list of names, you may have noticed Dave Piccolo. And I'm going to introduce Dave. Many of you know Dave. Dave is a longtime downtown realtor. Dave has had a history with Century 21 Sheets and is currently at Remax. Dave is in the process of joining Platt, which we're very, very excited about. So welcome to Dave and welcome to the call. This is an atypical way for us to get to introduce someone, and partially because Dave's transfer is not official. We would just say, please keep this in the group here for now and give Dave the chance to like all of us, give him the chance to handle that communication with his coworkers and with his clients and social media, et cetera, as he chooses to. So great to have you on the call today, Dave. Thanks for joining. Second thing I wanted to point out, I'm going to send out some information after the call. So we're going to hit on a lot of things. We'll send out some stuff from Phil afterward to just recap. So, do try to take notes, but know that you're going to get some stuff from us afterward. I think you're probably going to be hearing from me or Jess about a disclosure that's been making its rounds. IAR put out a new document that is designed as a disclosure form that a seller and listing broker would be asking people to sign who are coming into the house. That I think is a good idea. But we're going to try to not do the things that we could do over email in this call. So you're going to hear about some of that stuff. So maybe just putting off questions about that until later. One thing I would point out, there's a graphic from Showing Time that's floating around that I will send after the call. If you haven't seen this yet, I would suggest you take a look at it so that you know And I got kicked off. Well, okay, looks like I'm back. That's good. So anyway, this graphic from Showing Time that I'm going to send out later, I would just encourage you to take a look at that. Essentially, what we've all probably been anticipating for a couple weeks, which we maybe thought was going to happen earlier, is now clearly happening. Showings are well down. But one thing I would point out from that graphic, so you'll be able to look at the graphic yourself, is that I actually think what this graphic indicates is not necessarily that there are fewer buyers in the marketplace, because we haven't seen pending activity yet drop down significantly. We might, and I actually think we will. I think what that graphic indicates is the buyer who maybe normally would have been doing 8 showings is doing 1 or 2. And that I think what is supposed to have happened here is happening, which is as many activities as possible are going virtual. Y'all are working on this. I think all agents are working on this. So yes, I do think a decline in pendings is coming, but just FYI, if you see that graphic, keep in mind that those aren't necessarily one and the same. We could see a larger decline in showings than we do in pending transactions, which is actually what I think is going to happen. So, because I know a lot of you had probably looked at that, or you will, I wanted to throw that out there. Okay, Megan, thanks for being willing to share about your experience and make a suggestion in terms of something that might be good for us to spend time working on. So take it away.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everybody. Hope you're. When Dave Piccolo popped up on the call, there was a split second when I thought I've joined the wrong Zoom call. So welcome, good to have you. And that's just me and my technology paranoia. But anyway, so I just want to share a quick little story with you guys about something I'm kind of trying to do right now. It relates more to mindset than it really does to actual business development. And before I tell you what I'm doing, I'm going to be really honest and share that that first week that we were all home, I struggled. I had a really hard time concentrating. I felt like I was kind of going in a million directions. I was doing the minimum for work, but I certainly wasn't doing everything I could be doing. And so about halfway through that week, I kind of decided 2 things. The first was that I was going to give myself that week. I was going to give myself a break and say, hey, show yourself some grace. Take this time to adjust to what we're dealing with, process it, grieve a little, take too many naps, whatever it is. And then, but also next week, that's got to change because you've got to get some processes in place and you've got to get in a routine. And so I made a list of like 5 to 7 things I could do every day. And I hung it in a high traffic area of my house. And the idea was I'd see it. If I didn't know what to do with myself, hopefully I'd find something on that list to do. I laugh. The first thing is shower and get dressed. I am of the Spencer school of thought of I'm more likely to treat it like a work day if I'm up and dressed for work, or at least just dressed, period. So anyway, but one of my number one priorities was to really work on what I've, for lack of a better term, call my morning routine. And the idea is that it's 3 or 4 things that you do each day before I do anything else work related. So ideally before I even look at my work email, before I start thinking about phone calls and texts and what plumber I need to call for this inspection response, I would do 3 pretty simple things. I have a notebook that I keep, and every day has a page. And the first thing I do is write down 3 things I'm grateful for. You've heard that before. I know Amy's a big believer in this too. I try to make them as unique as possible so that the same thing doesn't appear twice ever. It really challenges you to kind of think outside the box sometimes on that. The second thing I do is I spend a little bit of time each day reading something that's either motivational or business development related. Right now I'm actually kind of doing both because I'm reading Shift and as well as something else. And I don't spend a ton of time. I do about a chapter from each book a day. But what I'm really looking for, what are things I can take notes on? What are those nuggets of information that I can kind of write down on my page for the day and be my takeaways for that day? And then the third thing I do is I handwrite 2 personal notes to 2 different people every day, and I drop them in the mail, snail mail style. And it's easy, it's fun, it's something I enjoy, and I know people enjoy receiving them because I get lots of great feedback. So the way this kind of ties into Mark's 60-day plan that he challenged us with last week which is now you only have 53 days. I just made the suggestion that kind of if you are making an effort every day to make intentional contact with your sphere, if you write that down and keep a record of it, I think when you get to the end of 60 days, you'll be really impressed with what you accomplished and how many people you were able to connect with. That list also keeps me a little accountable. I don't like to miss a day because there's this big blank page, and I feel bad about that. But it also reminds me of what I've accomplished already and kind of motivates me to keep going. So just a thought as it relates to Mark's 60-day plan. And then one other like quick tip that I learned a couple years ago, and I think it's helpful. So some of you may have already experienced this in the last week. There will be a time when you're like, okay, I'm gonna make contact with somebody today, but who? Like who am I gonna write a note to today? I've written 25 notes in the last month. Or who am I going to call, or who am I going to reach out to? I use social media a lot to kind of watch for opportunities. So I'm trying to limit my social media right now, more, so I'm not on there as much as normal. But if I am struggling to figure out who am I going to reach out to today, it's a great way to kind of scroll through with that intention, and you'll pretty quickly find somebody that could probably stand to hear from you, or a note or a call or a text or whatever it is. So that's it. That's my spiel.
Yeah, it's really great. I have commented to many of you that Megan's habit of writing cards has had an impact on me personally. And I think it's just a great example of something that you can exercise discipline in. And I love that idea of 60 days from now, looking back at like a list of like, oh, wow, that seems intimidating on the front end, but with a little bit of discipline each day, you look back on the back end, and that's a big impact. So that's great. Okay, so I'm going to introduce my friend Phil. Phil Daubenmeyer from Merchants Bank is here with us, and I'm really grateful for Phil being willing to join. I want to point out that everyone, including the most significant, largest SBA lenders in the state of Indiana, are learning as they go because things change daily. And we've had some conversation about the Paycheck Protection Program and what does it mean for independent contractors, or for those of you that have incorporated, what does it mean for realtors, and should we be applying, and what does it look like to apply, and how does it work? So I sent out a lot of resources. I'm assuming that most of you have some kind of baseline familiarity, and many of you, or I don't know about many, but at least several of you who are incorporated have already filled out applications. I know several of us have actually had applications approved, which is great. I've asked Phil to help us understand what is it that's coming up this Friday? How does it work for an independent contractor? What makes that different from the other one? And just how does the program work in general? And to be clear, and Phil's going to share this, you do have the option of working with Phil's bank, with Merchants Bank. He's going to suggest that you work with a bank you have a relationship with. So this is like not Phil trying to get as many applications as he can. Phil is here out of just being generous with his time to help us understand. So really appreciate that, Phil. I'm going to hand it off to him and let him take it away. Rosie, if you have not yet, or we don't need to make Phil host. Phil is able to share. Okay. I trust your IT skills, Rosie. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate everyone having me. Just to reiterate, I'm in no position to gain from this. My background at Merchants Bank, it's the only bank I've ever worked for 15 years. And I've worked in small business lending, I've worked in operations, and I currently oversee a credit group that does loans for our multifamily side of the business. So we are heavily involved in the multifamily industry. And so I oversee the credit group on that side. So I am not a business banker. I'm not an originator. So I'm here simply to help spread the word about the PPP program. And because of my relationships from my small business days, I have had customers come to me and try to get processed through this program. So so that's one caveat. The second caveat is kind of to where Mark was leading, this program is changing almost on a daily basis. And so the forms even have changed, including like 24 hours before the program went live. The SBA had changed the forms. And so half the applicants that we received had applied on the wrong form. And it's just been somewhat of a disaster. Now, some of those wrinkles are being ironed out, and we're starting to see applications flow more smoothly. But that was the first phase of it. So to go into what Mark was leading to, the first phase was primarily for what you would call your small business entities, your LLCs, your S Corps, any sort of organized entity that is doing business. And they basically kept all the independent contractors cut out of that application process until this Friday. Why they did that, I don't know, probably just to alleviate the workload, because as soon as Friday morning hit, I know we had staff working all weekend until late hours of the night processing applications, trying to get applications through the system. So that's what we can expect this Friday, is now that the independent contractors are now opened up into this program, we are seeing a dwindling down of the S Corps, the LLCs. Pretty much those that are going to apply are applying today. It's been much less busy today than it was earlier this week, and definitely this weekend. And so you can sort of see the downward trend of S Corps and LLCs. And then I think everyone's preparing for the onslaught of the independent contractors. So another thing I did want to highlight is basically every bank is doing it differently. And that's partly because the program has been mashed together so quickly that there's not a lot of guidance out there. So for example, what Mark is going to send around and what I'll share my screen with later this afternoon or later on this call is basically what merchants is collecting. Part of the due diligence process, again, is we're trying to guess what the SBA is going to want to see, because there's a lot of risk out there. There's a lot of risk to you as the borrower, because so much of this program is actually forgivable. And so that means that a portion of the loan that you get, you don't have to repay, and the SBA will make that payment for you. So it's important to know, A, what that forgiveness amount looks like, but also B, we don't know. I should back up. The SBA is notorious for trying to get out of their guarantee, right? On a typical small business loan, the SBA says, hey, bank, you go do a loan, we'll back it 75%. So if there's a loss, we'll make the bank whole up to 75% of that. Well, just like insurance companies and any other sort of person that backs debt, the SBA is notorious for trying to get out of that. And so there's a lot of concern about what are they going to do with this forgiveness. And so some banks are going very minimal in their due diligence, and other banks are going heavy, like us, because we want to make sure that we protect our borrower from any sort of loophole that says, no, the SBA comes back and says, you didn't collect X, Y, and Z, and so we're not going to forgive all of your debt. So that's also a product of this program being so new and kind of cobbled together so quickly. There's also a risk to the bank, right? Because the SBA has come back and said 100% of this loan is backed by the SBA. So if there's any loss at all, the bank will be made whole. That sounds great, and it sounds great on paper. So, so as you talk to your peers and there's stories of, okay, US Bank maybe do this, and Chase maybe do this, and merchants maybe do this, it's probably going to be very different, because we don't all have the same playbook that we're building our programs on. So lastly, I did want to go through and give you guys an idea of, if you were to apply at merchants, what that would look like. And so I'm sharing my screen right now. This is our PPP application checklist. This is structured around, an entity level. So it's going to be a lot of NAs for independent contractors. So just take it with a grain of salt. And so I did want to give you a snapshot, though, of all the due diligence that we're asking borrowers to send to us. And it's a decent amount. It's their borrowing entity documentation that they filed with this Secretary of State. It's all of their payroll data, including IRS forms, corresponding bank statements that show the payroll actually coming out, so that the SBA, if needed, could back that with the payroll statements and say, okay, your payroll statement said you paid X. We want to see the actual statement that it came out of, because the SBA historically has been pretty tight on that sort of stuff. Financial statements for trailing 12, and then miscellaneous other certifications. Certification that employees live within the United States, utility statements, mortgage statements, because those are things that the SBA has said you can use your proceeds to apply to. And so again, the SBA is going to want to see at the end of the day, when you apply for forgiveness, hey, we gave you $5,000. We want to verify that you used it for the appropriate purposes. So again, I don't know what other banks' checklists look like. I've heard that ours is longer than others. And I don't really have a good explanation of what is right or wrong. It's just a different frame and different business model, I think. So lastly, before we open up for questions, as Mark alluded to, different banks are taking a different strategy on how to deal with the avalanche of customers that are seeking assistance. Some banks are saying they're only doing business with their current customers. Some banks are opening it up to everybody. And some banks, like merchants, are saying, we will not say no to anyone. We will take applications for everybody. But in order to manage workloads, we are addressing current customer applications first. And then once we work through those, then we will process non-customer applications. So again, there's not a right way, there's not a wrong way. And if banks were appropriately staffed with the thousands of applications that they were seeing, I think it would be just everybody on a first come, first served basis, no matter what. But because of the overload, there's some sort of strategic way to try to differentiate who should we address first. And so merchants has chosen to do current customers first and then non-customers later. So I've heard of other banks doing the same. I've heard of other banks being much tighter on that, but it's all over the board. So I would absolutely encourage, if you have relationships with a current bank today, reach out to them first. It also could benefit you because some of the bigger banks have a more automated process. They don't have all of this documentation that they're requiring, and so they can streamline it faster. So I've heard turnaround times at big banks be significantly faster than merchants. And that's a product of those banks having more resources to build in. In the days leading up to this program, they had programmers on payroll that they could try to automate their processes and get them through the system faster than a community bank like Merchants is. We have 3 locations here in town. They're all on the north side. We're not a heavy small business lender, though we try to serve our community. And so we're just, frankly, just not staffed from an infrastructure or technology perspective to work through all those applications as fast as some of the bigger banks were. So trying to be candid with that, but also we still want to serve our community as much as we can. So with that, I will open it up to questions if you have any. Again, with full disclosure, I'm not an accountant, I'm not a tax advisor, and I'm not an originator. So,
thank you, Phil. Maybe comment a little bit on how the loan application size is calculated, and then the forgiveness ratio, and specifically for 1099s. I'm assuming that's off of a 12-month average. What 12 months? Is there flexibility to that? So maybe just talk about what can you apply for, and within reason, what should you expect to be eligible for on the forgiveness?
yeah, so out of the guidance that we've seen, and I would recommend that everyone goes to the Treasury's website, if not already, to see the actual guidance there. So I have this pulled up. So this is what it looks like, is the Department of Treasury Assistance for Small Business. You can just Google Treasury Small Business if you haven't been on there. This interim final rule, which is hilarious for one, that the SBA would come up with an interim final rule. That tells you everything about this program, is that there's an interim final rule. And then read through that. That really helps you navigate what the SBA is gonna do. But at a very high level, you're basically looking at your last 12 months worth of payroll. You're averaging them out, and then you're taking on a month, basically on a monthly average, you're applying for 2.5 times what that payroll looks like. So my assumption is for contractors, that's your own last 12 months worth of pay. They don't ask you to weight it most recent. They don't ask you to do anything else. Basically, it's just a 12-month average over the last 12 months. To be honest, I've seen some of these calculations, they are fuzzy, right? So I have seen borrowers say, hey, my last 3 months, we've really ramped up production. I've really grown my staff. So I'm going to put a little bit of weight on them. I'm going to put more weight on the last 3 months than I did the entire year. The guidance doesn't really speak to that, so I'm not telling them yes or no. The onus is on the borrower to do it correctly per the guidance. So I would say read that guidance and go as much as possible towards that. And then what's the forgiveness is basically 8 weeks worth of payroll. There may be some other nuances in there, but if you'll notice, 8 weeks of payroll forgiven is less than, in theory, your last, basically your calculation, your loan amount is calculated on 2.5 times your average. So most people will have a larger loan than what is eligible to be forgiven. And so those loans are on a 2-year basis. All payments are deferred for 6 months. So there's no payments on these loans for 6 months. And then basically whatever is left over after forgiveness, you have 2 years to pay back. And so again, there's not a lot of guidance from the SBA how that is going to work. Is it going to be like kind of term payments like you would a car loan every month, or is it all going to be due at the end of 2 years? There's no guidance on that. So every bank is doing it differently. And I think honestly, no one has even really gotten that far yet. Everyone is just trying to process applications. I know our bank, we're just trying to sign people up and get them into the system. We have not funded any dollars yet today because we're just trying to get dollars approved by the SBA before it runs out. So there still are a lot of questions out there as to what that actual loan will look like going forward.
Quick question on the 12-month calculation, Phil. In our industry, we do see a lot of fluctuation month to month in income. And so the 12 months that someone chooses may have a big impact on what their average turns out to be. And all the language I've seen says last 12 months, but yet I have seen a lot of people just using 2019, January, December. As far as you know, it's reasonable to use, say, 2019 calendar year, or say April 1 of 2019 through March 31st of 2020. Either of those would be reasonable?
To my knowledge, yes. I mean, like you, I've seen both. I don't know that, again, the SBA did not put the onus on the bank to make sure that we vetted that. It's really on the borrower. So the borrower has to certify that the information that they're providing is correct and accurate per the guidance. And so, yeah, it's very gray, but I've seen both apply for and both get approved, if that makes sense.
That's great. So we have a couple good questions here. Steve has asked about time limits and when does the window close to being able to do this? His comment was he thought maybe about kind of standing by while people that have a more urgent need apply and then coming in later and applying. Comment on that, Phil?
Yeah, so the only time window that is really going to be realistic is when the money runs out. So the SBA or Congress approved $375 billion to go into this program. There's now talks of another $200 billion being added to the program. I think it's clear that the money will run out eventually. As to who should apply and who shouldn't, it's not, again, the onus has not been put on the banks to determine who gets the money and who doesn't from a need-based perspective. It's simply from a which application do we get at what time. So I really respect the idea of, hey, I don't need it, so I'm going to let others kind of get first in line, and I think that's great. I just would say that there is a potential that there is a cap at some point and the faucet gets shut off. And so if you're in a position that you choose not to apply to it, I know borrowers that are taking that position, and that's more of a personal choice and strategic choice than anything else.
Christina has asked about prepayment penalty. After the 6-month deferral, assuming you have some balance left that's going to get amortized in 2 years, you can pay that all at once, right?
Absolutely. Yep. No penalties.
Phil, one question that I've had a couple people ask me is they've heard us say you should apply with a lender that you currently have a relationship with. And a couple people have said specifically, well, I have a checking account where my 1099 pay from the brokerage goes into a checking account with JP Morgan Chase. But I have an investment property where I have a mortgage with NBOI. And my personal mortgage is with Centir. This was a very specific person.
These are awfully specific examples. Interesting.
Yeah. If there are multiple relationships, personal debt, investment debt, or checking, any suggestion on kind of order of priority, like which bank relationship do you think carries the most weight if you were the banker?
So my totally candid answer is whatever relationship you have, that is truly a relationship. So if you know someone at a bank, if you have a relationship with someone, even if it's once a year versus you're applying via a website because you don't know who to talk to, I would lean less on what the function of that relationship is and more on, is there actual relationship there that you can call somebody and actually apply through a person versus, well, I have a checking account at Chase. I don't even know who to call, so I'm going to Google their website and see how to go about it. That may be less efficient than, hey, my Centir guy I talk to every 6 months. We don't have a great relationship, but at least I have someone to talk to and call. That's probably where I would start with because candidly, those are the relationships that I'm processing are customers that I have dealt with in the past that knew to call me and say, hey, I know it's been a while since we talked, but I have my account here. We have a relationship over the years. Can you help me get started on this application? And that at least gave them a jump start versus trying to search on our website on how to apply. So that would be my guidance.
Yeah, Jenny commented about Centir saying that she had to have a business checking account. I've heard of a couple other banks saying that they're not viewing a mortgage. Like that bank is setting their threshold, right? So that's Centir's decision. That's not a part of the program, but Centir is deciding we're only taking applicants if you have a business checking account. I know, for example, PNC, a friend of mine in a different industry who's a 1099, is establishing a business checking account with PNC today.
Yep.
In order to be able to apply. So that could be an option. If you have a relationship with a banker, but don't have a business checking account with them, you could establish that business checking account to meet that bank's threshold. And that might be better, not to pick on Chase. I think, if I remember correctly, Kelly, your approval came from Chase. I think Chase is approving loans. So we'll just pick on Chase for a moment, hypothetically. But if you have a business checking account, but it's with a bank where you don't have a relationship, you could pursue the option of opening a business checking account somewhere where you do. So those are all possibilities. Yeah, Natalie asked a really good question. Phil, we have an agent here who's asking, because I believe, Natalie, you're incorporated, so you've already applied with a bank that isn't her main bank. And then kind of now hearing this like level of priority that banks are placing on existing customers, what would you think about attempting to like revoke or cancel that application and going to another bank right now and applying, or should she just let it stay in the queue?
So we had a couple customers actually do this really intelligently, I think. They applied to multiple banks at one time, and then as soon as they got their approval from one bank, they just canceled it with the rest, which included us. You know, they first applied with us, saw our due diligence list and said, that's going to be a pain. Called, they had a really good relationship locally, called them and were able to get approved faster than us. And then just sent us an email and said, hey, I'm already approved somewhere else. You can cancel it. And so we canceled that application and we just moved on. And so I thought that was actually a pretty smart strategy. It's something that I would have done in that position. I would have sprinkled it about because I know you can't get multiple loans, but there's nothing that says you can't apply multiple places. So that's actually a pretty wise strategy. If I were anybody in your position, if you have multiple bank setups, just apply for them all and see which one hits. And then just try to be as courteous as possible and let the other banks know that you need to cancel it so that they can then focus on other ones that are in the queue.
That's great. Amy Jones has asked if we could apply before Friday. I believe Amy is not incorporated, so this is a question about independent contractor. Phil, you could probably submit something to a banker prior to Friday.
Correct. And that's a good idea is to get your application into the bank ahead of Friday, but the bank won't be able to submit until Friday. But that way you're first in line or first in the line of other thousands. But at least you're in there, you've gotten your due diligence in. Maybe someone's been able to look through it and say, this all looks good. But yeah, I don't think it behooves anybody to wait to get your due diligence or to get that process started.
Kelly, that's great. I just noticed Kelly commented that 2 of her 3 applications had been approved and that one of those has funded.
That's great.
As far as I know, Kelly's the first person that I know personally that has actually had funding. So yeah. Kelly, don't go spending all that in one place. Unless it's your payroll, then do it in one place. Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of questions about when the time comes for forgiveness. Best guess, Phil, on how this is verified. So the question is, how we'll be asked to show what it was used for, how exhaustive that process is going to be. This person is asking, like, it could be for mortgage interest or rent. Just any commentary on what you think is going to happen 8 weeks from now?
So one thing that we're trying to, and we actually might mandate when we start funding, to make this easier, we might open up accounts for each borrower specifically for PPP proceeds so that there is one separate account that is easy to track. It's easy for people to document exactly where the dollars went each time versus commingling it with your other accounts and personal accounts. So that way, when it does come time, again, this has never been done before, so no one really knows what is going to be required when they ask for forgiveness. My guess is that they're going to want to see, okay, we saw $5,000 go out of the account. I need a statement for $5,000 that shows it went to mortgage interest, or $250 went to your utilities, or whatever else. Like, I think it's going to be similar to like a expense reimbursement for a corporation. You know, when you go out and wine and dine clients, they want to see receipts for everything. My assumption is that it's going to be that onerous. And so if you can funnel all the proceeds and use those proceeds as sort of one source of all that loan proceeds, that's probably the best way to go to make it simple.
Yeah, we actually, the bank that I've had a couple approved with suggested very similarly. They said, what we're recommending is that you actually set up a new deposit account with us for nothing but this.
Right.
We will, when we get the money or when we get the final approval, we will deposit your loan into that account and don't use that account for anything other than the eligible expenses, utilities, rent, mortgage interest, payroll. And so that it'll be very easy to verify. You never mingled the funds with anything else. So I think that's maybe the most conservative strategy on how to verify. Joel, question there about clarifying the percentage of forgiveness. So guys, where this is going to be particularly tricky for our industry. I'm going to answer this question because it is a little bit different in our industry than it might be in others. So the loan that you're applying for, you can apply for up to 2.5 months worth of your running 12-month average of pay, up to $100,000 of annual average. So let's use, for example, someone that makes, over the last 12 months, they made $5,000 a month on average. They made $60,000 in the last year. So in that scenario, that person could apply for $12,500. Okay, that's 2.5 months of what they make. They apply for $12,500. The forgiveness on this is actually going to be a function of the next 8 weeks and what you pay in rent, mortgage interest, utilities, and what you're compensated. So as a business owner applying for W-2 pay reimbursement, this is different. But I think this is going to be a key question in terms of what percent is going to be eligible for forgiveness. If you're a salaried employee receiving help through your employer, your pay tends to be very consistent, which means somewhere between 80 and 100% of the loan is going to be forgiven. I think this is going to be trickier for a lot of us because your pay goes up and down so much. But here's the thing I would say, Joel, I don't think your concern would need to prevent you from applying for the loan, because the first 6 months are deferred and there's no prepayment penalty. So my suggestion, my team and I talked about this yesterday, is that you could go ahead and apply for 2.5 months of your running average pay. If you are approved, get the money, set it into a separate account, be very conservative with it, only use it for eligible expenses. Your worst case scenario, if you don't burn that money in some other way, your worst case scenario is you have a low percentage of that loan forgiven and you just repay the rest with the money that's already sitting there. And with a 6-month deferral window and no prepayment penalty, it wouldn't have cost you anything to do that. And by the way, there's no loan fee. You're not paying money on the front to do this. There's not a prepayment penalty, and you defer for 6 months. So I think it may turn out not to have saved you a bunch of money if the percentage of your particular circumstances turned out to be low. But I think there's a pretty big upside in terms of, I think some of you are likely going to end up seeing in that 80 to 100% of the loan being forgiven, especially those of you that are in your second or third year and may end up making a bit more money right now than you did on the running 12-month average. But sorry, Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things that I sent Mark to send out is basically what we're having borrowers fill out, which is a simple payroll calculator. Basically see what they're eligible for. Again, this is built for more LLCs and S Corps. And then also to try to give them an idea of what could be forgiven. So there's payroll costs for 8 weeks, rent payments for 8 weeks, interest on a portion of mortgage payments. Again, you'd have to dig into the guidance of whether that's your own home mortgage versus the business mortgage. And for independent contractors, maybe that's the same thing. And then utility payments. And so it'll give you a breakout. And so you'll be able to see the difference between what you're eligible for and then what you could be forgiven. One caveat is the guidance does say that no more than 25% of the forgiveness may be this stuff, this rent, interest, and utility. So basically they want 75% of the forgiveness. They want it to be payroll. And Mark, to your point, as independent contractors, don't you essentially pay yourself whatever you want, right? So couldn't you make up the amount? I don't know how that works, but it's different for a business entity showing that they paid employees. When you're paying yourself through the way that you guys do it, I don't know if you can sort of play with the system that way, but regardless, you guys will get this calculator, which will help you make that decision.
I got kicked off there for a minute, which means my chat started over. I think there was another 2 or 3 questions there that I hadn't gotten to. Rosie, if you still have the full chat, I think I didn't get to 2 or 3 of them. Can you ask those of Phil?
Yep. Just one second. Phil, what is the advantage of applying through a bank versus applying directly on the SBA website?
So for one, this PPP program is only through banks. The SBA has other economic injury loans that they've made available to borrowers to apply for. That is directly with the SBA. There's no bank involvement. So you apply to the SBA works with you to determine whether you're eligible, et cetera. The PPP program is only through banks. There is no way to apply via SBA directly. Now, they may be able to route you to another bank, but you cannot apply through this program directly with the SBA. It has to be through a bank.
Thanks, Phil. Mark, that is the end of the chat questions as far as I'm seeing. Correct me if I'm wrong, y'all.
I do see one new one on here. I'll ask that one in a second. Quick clarifier there, Phil, you probably know more than I do. The EIDL loan that you can apply directly at SBA.gov, as far as I know, that is only for small businesses. Independent contractors, individuals are not eligible for EIDLs, correct?
Okay. I have not looked into it because it is a direct program. So I don't know. I can't answer that.
I'm not certain on that. We'll try to verify. I know small businesses are eligible, but yeah, very different program. And the main difference here is that the Paycheck Protection Program has a significant forgiveness component, which the EIDL is more designed as an actual loan for cash flow. So Amy and Stefan both in similar situations so if you were an independent contractor last year, therefore you weren't running payroll, you weren't paying yourself salary out of an S Corp or an LLC. I believe the documentation that you're going to need is actually your 1099 documentation from either this brokerage or if you were with another brokerage last year. So it's the same documentation you would use on your 2019 tax return. Ashley, I think, is on with us. We have, if you were a plat agent last year, we have the documentation that you'll need to submit. But I believe what they're using in replacement of when a business submits, they're using their payroll information. I think for an independent contractor, it's actually the 1099 documentation that you would get from the vendor, which in this case would be your brokerage. Phil, is that your understanding as well?
So the definition of payroll costs in the guidance for independent contractors is wage, commissions, income, or net earnings from self-employment or similar compensation. So it sounds vague to me, but it does include commissions, and income is listed, but it's very general. Doesn't say what type of income, but it does say income.
Yeah, so it might be a question for the particular bank that you're applying through. You're not the only independent contractor that's talking to them. My guess is they're going to ask for a 1099 IRS forms.
Yep.
To validate. Absolutely. As opposed to payroll forms. Yeah. Yep. Certainly more that we could hit on there. This is very, very helpful. Anybody have something that we feel like we haven't hit on that you'd like to ask? Feel free to jump in here last minute. Otherwise, we'll probably let Phil go and take our break.
Just to re-clarify, that loan is at 1%. So very low interest rate, which means banks are not making money on these. This is absolutely a time for banks to step up and serve the community. Our chairman emailed the bank last week and said this was our patriotic duty to step up. We're not going to worry about the lack of fees. We're not going to worry about the interest income. We're going to process as many applications as we can absolutely get out the door. And so just keep that in mind as everyone is scrambling and trying to get as many applications through the door. It's just trying to meet the demands of the community.
Well, Phil, we really appreciate you joining. Thank you so much. Very helpful resource. I'm sure there's going to be questions as those of you who are working on this. My experience says the person that is the best fit to answer your questions is whatever bank you end up applying with. Everybody's process looks a little different. So I think if you have a general understanding, action item number 1 is choose who you will apply with, and then try to talk to someone there to have them answer your questions, because they might give you a different answer.
Yep.
And that's what you should do.
I just had a question texted to me. Is it okay if I ask?
Yeah.
Can you submit an application for each company you own that has a payroll?
Yes.
So yes.
Cool. Thank you. That's all.
Yeah. It's tracked as an independent contractor. You can only submit one because it's going to be associated to your social security number. Well, you could submit the same application to multiple lenders, but you're only going to get one loan. If you own multiple businesses, they're actually using the federal ID number. And so Kelly has submitted 3, I submitted 4. You are able to do that.
Thank you.
Phil, we release you to go and process applications.
I'm on it.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, very, very helpful. Okay, well, thanks for engaging on that, everybody. I do want to be a resource as you're continuing to look at this. I know several of you have asked me some questions about it. I mean, I am definitely not an expert, but if I can help you get your arms around the general understanding of the program, I'm happy to do that. But hopefully all of you are able to connect to a banker to apply through them. Let's take a quick 5-minute break. For those that are engaging with the reading of Shift, let's just circle back here at 4 o'clock. And thanks for Emily being willing to lead us. So hit pause for 5 minutes, come back at 4 for that conversation. All right. Well, glad to have so many of you sticking on, and thanks, Emily, for being willing to lead discussion. Hopefully, y'all have enjoyed or found some value in reading Shift thus far. Just a quick reminder that while the book was written in a decade ago, I think a lot of it still applies. Keep in mind that no two times and places are going to be identical, so some of these things may not apply, but I think it's been really valuable for me. So Emily, I'm going to hand it over, and so just as a reminder, we're going to cover 2 tactics today, get highlights from Emily, and then we'll do the same thing. So we're going to be going over tactics 3 and 4 in the brokerage call a week from today. So take it away.
All right. Hi, guys. Can you guys hear me? Yes. Okay, awesome. It's good to be with you guys today. So this is actually the first time I've read this book. So I just kind of went through and made some notes and kind of like hashed out how the different tactics kind of like impacted me and maybe some things I thought would be helpful. So let's do it. So basically with the tactics, I kind of view them as like tactic 1 is a philosophy or a mentality kind of idea. And then 2 through 12 are really going to be kind of like application pieces. But the first tactic that he went through is how are you going to shift when the market shifts? And so he talks about the 2 shifts that you need to make, a mental shift and an action shift. So the mental shift, I feel like, is something that we've been talking about a lot as a brokerage, or at least there's pieces of that that I think that we're kind of talking about. Primarily, he says that we can't let our fears be bigger than our goals. And so he does kind of address this idea of like, yes, there's going to be a emotional shift that happens when the market shifts. We can feel that, kind of like what Amy said last week, of like, we can lament that or be upset about it, and then, but it's time to kind of like move on and have a focus towards our goals. And he identified kind of 3 different types of people who are fearful, kind of like the unrealistic optimist, and what I like to call the realistic optimist, which is kind of what he recommends. So people who just kind of like are spinning and unable to get their grounding are the fearful ones. Unrealistic optimistic is like, it's going to be fine, and just maybe ignore things or don't put the effort in to make the change. And realistic optimistic is basically like, yes, we know that the market is bad. We still want to work to the best of our ability and work hard. We realize we may fail, but that's okay. We need to still put the effort in. One of the things that stood out to me personally was this idea of, he says that you need to get real with your situation. And so I think that it's really fair for there to be a lot of you that are still fearful. So I think all of us handle situations differently. All of us are like fight or flight. I tend to be a big fighter. So like when adversity hits, my predisposition as a person is like to do it. Like, let's go figure out what the solution is. But that's not everyone. And I think Mark's alluded to this the last couple of weeks since this has all started, of like, there's some real changes happening. I mean, I've never been in a global pandemic either. So I think we're all trying to work through that. But one of the things that I thought about is like, how do I assess where I am when I'm feeling stressed? So I tend to run into a fire and then forget that I'm getting burnt and then have to reassess on the back end. But other people may be afraid to even run in. And so the things that really help for me, I think it's really important to identify what you're really afraid of. So, okay, caveat, I'm not a life coach or a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but these are just things that help me. And that I've talked to some of my other friends and mentees about is, what are the things that I'm really afraid of? Are those things realistic fears? And what are the things that I can do around that fear to help me rise out of it? So I think that I think our illusions of control have been really shaken in this time. And so the reality is we don't have a ton of control of a lot of things externally, but we have a lot of control internally of how we can address things or think about things. And so I think that those are good things to kind of go through the process of asking, like, do I have an unrealistic, like, for instance, if I'm afraid of getting sick, is that realistic? Yeah, that's a realistic goal. So what can I do? I can take care of myself. I can be wise for my family. I can do those sorts of things. If some fears are unrealistic, it may be worth just being like, hey, that is an unrealistic thing that I can't have any control over. And so I need to figure out how I'm going to manage that fear. One of the things that I know personally works for me, and I know Megan mentioned this as well, is that I would suggest journaling and self-reflection. I know that a lot of the things that people have been talking about now is talking to other people and connecting. And I think that's really, really, really great. And I think we should do that. But I know that if I'm engaging with another person, oftentimes I'm not as aware of what I'm feeling and how I'm engaging, and I'm very honest with myself as I am when I'm journaling or kind of going on a long walk and really thinking about something. But I would really encourage you guys to take time with yourself if you're still in that fearful place. So moving on into the mental shift. I think one of the things that stood out to me the most is that he said that we have the power to choose. I'm actually reading another book about the spiral of toxic thoughts and how to control the spiral of toxic thoughts in your mind. And it's exactly what the premise of that book is that we have the power to choose what we think about. We have our minds are predisposed to be worst case bad news thinking 70% of the time. And we have the opportunity to choose and to think differently if we want. So in this first section as well, I really like that he gave this analogy of a boat in high tide. And he basically said, like, when we're all in high tide, we kind of ebb and flow in life. And the question is, how do you get your boat into low tide and it's still floating? And so I think the reality is that at least as long as I've been in real estate, I have been in high tide. So real estate transactions, it's been a good time to be in the market. I've never experienced a downturn and that sort of thing. And so it's time now to kind of like assess and say like, okay, low tide is coming. But that's okay. And so one of the other things that he says is, or the questions that I have and that I wrote down and that I'm still trying to figure out is, so what makes my boat float? And I think that's different for all of us to ask that question of, so if we're in high tide and we're doing things, if we go to low tide, then what does it mean for us to maintain a successful business? Let's see. One of the other things that I reflect on that as well is he kind of was talking about, you know, being a low tider and how we just have to work. Again, that's kind of like that, you know, optimistic, that realistic optimistic, I think is another way of saying, hey, I'm a low tider. And one of the things that he said is, know that there is always enough business for you to survive with a minimum income while striving for your maximum. And I know for me personally, I have been in a season that's been a strong market. And I can either look at this as like, what's my history in the market been? And this is a huge upset to me. But when I talk to any seasoned agent, they will all tell you that real estate is a cyclical market. Maybe it's not global pandemic cyclical or, you know, financial crash cyclical, but that there are cycles in real estate. And I think what has been helpful for me is to think about like, this is the nature of the business, maybe not to this extreme, but like, you know, this is what, there will be other downturns. There will be really great times in real estate. And so I think when I have that mental shift of saying like, this is kind of the nature of the beast of real estate, it feels a lot less scary. And so one of the questions I had is like, so how do we become agents who have successful businesses regardless of the market? So that's one thing to think about. The last thing he touched on with this mentality thing was just the idea of clarifying your goals and your priorities. And I know that for me personally, again, I think what is so unique about the situation that we're in is that it's not just an industry that's struggling. It's like everyone is trying to figure out what side's up in everything. And so the idea of like goal setting and clarifying your priorities and your vision really stood out to me. I really like New Year's because I like setting goals for the following year. And I have like a goal tracker that I keep and so forth. And so this has really upset a lot of my goals in terms of business, but it's actually allowed me to achieve some different goals and some things that I thought would be a little bit harder in my personal life, in some relationships and some other things. And so I just feel like this is an opportunity, again, like with a mentality shift where we can just say like, hey, you know what, this could be a time for us to reset some of our goals and vision for things. So maybe it's, you know, if there is a resource that you use for New Year's to set your goals, or maybe it's saying like, hey, what I've experienced thus far has helped me to kind of redefine what my priorities are. It's hard for me personally to set aside, and I don't know about you guys, but to set aside my business priorities from my life priorities. I think because as realtors, I at least feel like there is a lot of, you know, what I guess for me, I just kind of live everything all at once. And so, so for me, this has been a good time for me to reflect too, like personally, what do my relationships look like? What does my personal health look like? What are those sorts of things? And then also, what does my business look like? Yeah. Anybody have anything to share on that? Does that, anybody have anything to say? I want to give a chance.
I have a question. That's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious for the group, like along that first tactic, talking about, like, I think it's like get real and get right, which is super cheesy, but that's how it goes. Like, have you guys been able to get your mind around it? Like, are you guys in like planning mode, or are you in freak the fuck out mode, or, you know, where are you at? It's a little vulnerable to share in front of everyone, but I'm just kind of curious if you guys are grappling with it well, or what's happening.
Or
Anyone?
type it.
Or type it.
We'll see
Yeah,
your name, but then it's less scary.
it's vulnerable.
This is Natalie. I am surprised how much business has not changed yet. So I'm finding that really surprising. We're even adding new clients to our team right now. So it's just kind of weird, I think, and I'm not sure what everybody else is experiencing, but so far, beyond making the changes of physically seeing people and some other stuff, I think we're still feeling pretty busy as a team.
Yeah.
But I do think that one of the biggest takeaways from that first tactic in the book, and some of the things I wrote down that really stuck with me, is that when you start to write down what you really should be doing right now, that it's probably not going to be anything that's special and unique, in that top agents master the fundamentals and the basics are never outdated. And that's, I think that that's been something in my mind, no matter what kind of work I've done in my life, but I really believe in that. And that's something we've been trying to really hit home as a team, is that the basics are never going to fail you. Building relationships with people is never going to fail you. Being helpful to people as much as you can is never going to fail you, and it's going to come back to you in business. So I think that that is one of the biggest takeaways that I took, is that you can get distracted by lots of fancy tools that are out in the market and all these different things that you can spend money on or try out. But if you're not doing the basics, especially right now, I think that's when you're going to start to see your business slip away.
Yeah, Natalie, I think that's really good insight. That's something, I mean, I know my job is very different than what you guys do, but I think very similar thing applies, that I feel like this time, or in times of crisis, it just forces you to get a little tighter with, whatever you're doing, really challenges you to focus on what's most important. Yeah, it's a good takeaway.
Yeah.
I love your guys' answer. Depends on the hour. I'm freaked out. This is all so good.
When the kids aren't crying, it's good.
Yeah. Oh, sweet. That's the sweetest.
Should I keep going? Who else do we need to? Okay. So Natalie, I appreciate that. I feel like that was, like, in reading this, like tactic 2, like I could say it in one sentence and be done. And it makes sense. But I appreciate that. I feel like, so the other thing, so this was interesting too. So the second part of the tactic he talks about is action shift. And he says, act quick and act now. And my first question was, how do we know what to do? And then I wrote, well, it's the basics and the idea of just growing. And I think it's like, you know, a lot of this is what hopefully some of us have learned in real estate. But one of the things that he says is to look at things that must be done right and must be done right now, and that those will like personally dictate what you need to be doing. But I had a thought. So I was on a call earlier today, and this really struck me because I feel like there are some business practices that we have done in the past that we just can't do now, that were basics, right? So, because he touches on lead generation and lead conversion and what we need to do as agents and what that looks like. And it just feels kind of muddled a little bit right now of how do we do all those things? How do we generate leads? And just from a digital perspective, like there are some basic ways to do that, obviously. But I was thinking about a particular conversation we had about open houses and how I know a lot of people are generating leads from open houses. And I was thinking, man, what does that translate into for somebody? Like, what if an agent has open houses have really worked for them? Because I feel like this whole section is about find out what works for you, right? Do an analysis, sit down and track your leads. Like, I think those are all really smart things to do that I'm just now doing 4 years into the business of like, have I written all of my transactions down and written where I've gotten them and figured out where is the most bang for my buck in terms of lead generation? Is it relationship? Is, you know, like, so those are good things to do. But I was thinking about like, how do we be so connected in an unconnected capacity right now? And so I was thinking about people who capitalize a lot on open houses and just thinking, you know, what is it about an open house that helps someone to engage a new client? And sometimes it's seeing them face to face, but sometimes it's just being open and honest about who they are. And so I kind of just thought about like, remember that, like, to me, the open house is a plate and the thing that you offer is the meal, right? And so like, you can offer that meal in a different way and it maybe is going to look a bit different, but like, so maybe you're somebody who, if for open houses, has really shined in that area and developed business. Well, what does it look like for you to be as open with other people? Maybe it's digital media, maybe it's writing letters to people, you know, maybe it's, and showing the essence of who you are in a different format, but the same way. Does that make sense to anyone? So like, if I was doing an open house, I would say like, maybe I do an introduction of who I am and why I love business, you know, or love real estate, and share that with other people. Or maybe I write, you know, different letters to somebody, or maybe I do phone calls and just continue with those things. I just think sometimes we can feel defeated that the rhythm that we've done is now not working and we can give up. And it's like, you're actually the thing that people are drawn to, like, not the open house. So I just want to encourage people in that. So he talks about, let's see. Okay, so we're going to go on to tactic 2. Any comments about that? I mean, he just said act now and act quick, and it's very personalized to like what has worked in your business, and figure out what has worked in your business specifically, and then what can you focus on now. But is there any more comments about that or thoughts about that? All right. So the last one, this is like back to the basics, like what Natalie was mentioning before, but tactic 2 is remargining your expenses. So it's pretty straightforward. He's like, spend less money. So if a market shift causes he says, if a market shift causes your income to drop, but your expenses don't immediately drop in lockstep with it, then your profit margin is gone. And so I just thought that this was really like straightforward, but I can tell you that as a new agent, I struggled to build a budget. And like, that's a basic business thing. But I think when I was thrown into real estate, and maybe this is similar to all you guys, so maybe I'm the only one that's irresponsible. But I have been irresponsible. I mean, like I had business and there was other things. And so maintaining a business and maintain real estate and doing all these other things, I just didn't have all of that done. And I feel like this is an opportunity to make a budget. If you have a great one, great. If you have one, great. If not, like start now. And see where you're spending money. And then also then he says, see where you can cut the fat in business. I also put, see where you can cut the fat in business and maybe other expenses besides business as well, right? So there are a lot of other financial opportunities that are happening besides loans, you know, like depending on where you're going to be in terms of health. I don't want you to take on like a ton of debt or something like that, but like I just went and checked Dave's student loans today and they're completely delayed until September. And so that's just something that the government is doing. But so we're going to use that money that we had budgeted for and kind of redirect it and be pretty smart about it. So I think there's some financial opportunities there. To Natalie's question too, it says that every dollar that you spend should yield multiple dollars. And I think that this whole idea too of us being in a seller's market and a strong market for so long, we probably all are, yeah, that's what I was going to say, Jess, with red light and green light. Kind of this idea of we probably have been a little bit more loose with our spending too. And so now's the time to really buckle down on it. So the second thing that he says in the tactic, first one is protect your margin. So lead with revenue, working from a business profitability. And then it said, so when I was a new agent as well, like I didn't understand that process. And I feel like it was really helpful to, again, have somebody that's saying like, hey, lead with your revenue. And don't just assume that the money's coming in and be really smart with it. So he says, get your money smart again. So all the money that we have been spending now is, he calls it dumb because the market has changed. So we have to get back to the idea of what works in the action shift. He does say that you need to identify a benchmark for what you want to get back. So Natalie, I think your question said, is anyone tracking spending on returns for every dollar you spend and you expense? Did anybody see that? It'd be really great if anybody had any answer to that. Chris. So does anyone have, I mean, Mark, would you have or anyone else who's have like an idea of, hey, this is how much money we really should be looking at, like have like a general benchmark? I think they say multiple dollars to the one. I'm not sure how many multiple dollars we're talking about.
I think it's a hard question to take as a blanket because I think just what stage in career you're in, for example, how busy are you? So an agent that's really new in their career may choose to invest $1 at a much lower return in the short run because it helps them, pick up activity. And so I just think it just depends on what stage in your career. I think there are situations where you would be wise to take a 1-to-1 return. Mm-hmm. If you weren't busy and building a client base was of significant value. I actually think in the short run, you might even take negative returns in the short run. If it was a small dollar amount that you were investing and it helped you build a long-term client base. Now, I think as you get more experienced, that ratio would need to be a lot different. So mm-hmm. I think for the purpose of a book that millions of people are going to read, you try to keep it simple, but right. I think that would be my take on it.
Yeah. I think that that's wise. I mean, I think that you're exactly right. There's some dollars that we spend and they're not going to yield $1 back, right? But exponentially, it's going to maybe yield relationship, or it's going to yield awareness or something that you can't measure. And so there's those sorts of things as well that you have to kind of look at. So love the red light, green light, consider every expense and taking it off of auto pay, Jess. I'm just looking through notes real quick here. I think one of the things that, again, back to the basics of all of this is that basically in summary, this is saying, take a deep breath, everyone. This this too shall pass at some point. And I think that we can panic and spend a lot of money trying to build something or grow something, or we can just be committed to the basics of like have a good tight budget and or create a budget. Maybe you're not good at that right now. And so maybe this is a time where you're like, hey, I need to build a budget and figure this out. And I can take, a day to do that if things are slow, and, work through it with someone, or ask some questions. And so, know where your lead generation comes from and invest in those things. And I wrote all over my book, as I was reading things, stuff like, you guys, we know lead generation comes from relationships and connecting with people, and asking people for business and doing it in a way that's earnest. I was on the phone with Kelly earlier this week, and she gave great advice of like, hey, there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, I'm a small business owner in this day and age too, and I would really love your support. So if you know somebody that's buying or selling, I'd love to talk to them and for you to connect me with them, and that we can do those things. And that's, ask people for business and put yourself out there. So that's kind of all I have on those. I feel like unless somebody feels like I really completely missed something major, feel free to correct me. But
I thought it was pretty powerful when it said cut expenses today. And I think that some people think like, oh yeah, I'm going to look into it, I'm going to do it. But you can literally make changes today in the next 30 minutes that cut your expenses. And so about 35 days ago, we really made an effort to cut $500 from our monthly expenses, just personal stuff. And I think today we probably spent, I think it's like $1,500 less in the last 30 days than we typically would have by not going out to eat, not getting takeout, not getting delivery, cutting some of our monthly like TV subscriptions. We really don't need that many. So I think it's really applicable to your personal life as well as your business life. So I challenge everybody to do it. I challenge you all to track your monthly spending. It's really powerful month over month, watching your spending fluctuate up and down, because it can really help you reflect on, wow, one of us went out to eat way too much for lunch this month, or we really aren't using that system that we're paying for. We really should cut it. And chances are you're probably not going to miss it once it goes away, and it's going to be a lot harder to bring it back and spend that money again.
Yeah. I would also encourage you to, like, to Natalie's point as well, like I went through my business bank account, because like I have subscriptions to things that are $10 here and $20 there that are good ideas that are maybe getting my, like, oh, I want to do that business someday, and I've started it and haven't finished. And it's like, maybe I put those things on pause, or I just, cut those things down. I mean, I think that every little bit helps with that. So it's like, I just got rid of my MailChimp account. So see you later, MailChimp. Like I made sure that the people on my, on our personal emails with Google, like how many email addresses do I have and am I paying for, like those sorts of things I think are really, really easy to do. So get on your bank account and think, like, I think subscriptions are really a big thing as well, or like ones that have monthly fees, of like, man, do I need to be paying that? Or is there an option? And is that yielding anything at this point as well? So anyone else? Preach. All right. I'll leave it to Mark. There you go. I really hope that you guys all noticed the Jaguar in the back of my office as well.
What?
Do you see it? It's a piggy bank.
No. I see something.
I strategically placed it for you guys to enjoy.
Oh, once I zoomed in, yes. That's a nice piggy bank. Emily, that's really great. Yeah, thank you. I think You know, I was joking with a couple of people that sometimes it does take a shift like this to cause us to get into a mindset. So for example, like exercising discipline with the dollars that you spend, making sure they can answer for themselves. Like, yeah, we should be doing that in a good market too. But I think when you know that revenue could fluctuate more than it normally does, you may not have the ability to generate revenue rather than cut expense. And so I think that makes a lot of sense. Some good tips there on exercising that discipline. Hopefully this book is helpful. Keep reading it. We will circle back in a week to hit tactics 3 and 4. Look for some communication from us. We'll send out follow-up materials from Phil. And I think you're going to hear from me and Jess about the showing disclosure. And then, yeah, if you haven't seen it, that graphic from showing time, again, just if anybody wasn't on the call earlier, I would encourage you to look at that and know what it is and what it says, but also know what it doesn't say in terms of like a decline in showings would not necessarily be a one-to-one decline in transactions and certainly not in price. So great to be with you all virtually today. Thanks for joining. We're going to wrap it up now. Like I said before, if you have any questions on the Paycheck applications, feel free to reach out to me. But yeah, I'd encourage you to try to connect with a banker as well. So thanks, y'all. Have a great night.